There's something incomplete about all the legends we hear throughout our lives. There's an unfinished quality of them, an air of mystery, a little something that doesn't completely make sense. In some cases, this is used as an excuse to discredit these stories, their sources, and their origins entirely. In other cases, this serves as a temptation to find the truth, retrieve the missing piece of the puzzle, and write a satisfying ending to the story. But the best legends are never finished, because we are discussing tales that are, more often than not, much older than us and our ancestors, and that will live on for much longer than we and our grandchildren will live. However, there's an additional factor that plays into the characteristics of the legends, myths, ghost stories, or whatever you like to call them. The reasons why they weren't finished. The original narrator. Were they killed before finishing the story? Were they too traumatized to share the ending? Were they protecting a secret, themselves or someone else? This story might just be a perfect example to understand that point. The mysterious experience belongs to a man named Alan, who was part of a very large family, and, as it often happens, that meant it was a very distant family. Even his closest relatives had moved to different cities and countries through the years. Extremely serious or absurd arguments broke so many ties in the family. They were scattered around the world, and most of them didn't even talk about each other. It was just Alan's bad luck that he happened to live closest to the one lonesome and enigmatic uncle that nobody had seen in years. He didn't particularly want to visit his old uncle. He considered himself a little kinder and less problematic than most of his family members, but he also wasn't an aggressively empathetic man. Alan was quite bothered about being asked to check in on his uncle, just because his children lived abroad and all hated him, or each other, or were hated by him for some petty reason or another. But there was a very significant thing that convinced Alan to pack a bag, get in his car, drive a couple of hours, and agree to stay a few days with his uncle to at least get him back in shape. It was the alarming message the family received from a neighbour of the old man. One night, one of Alan's cousins received a message from a woman that lived next door to his father. The message went along the lines of the old man being suspiciously quiet for a few days, not leaving the house at all, until one night, he started making the strangest sounds, wailing as he was howling at the moon like an animal. The neighbour called him several times, but she only ever got him to end the call quickly. He picked up, though, so she knew he was alive. And every time she was about to call the police or an ambulance, the sounds stopped. Eventually, the woman understood she had to do something. She didn't want to make a big deal and end up looking like a nosy neighbour, so she sent one of her sons to simply knock on the door, say hello to the old man, and offer help if he ever needed something. At least, she thought it was simple. But imagine the poor woman's reaction when her young boy came back from the neighbour's house, pale as a ghost, shaking and crying quietly, but vehemently refusing to say what it was he saw in that house. He only reassured her that the old neighbour was alive and moving in his house. Her son's trauma couldn't be ignored. She had to do something. She immediately called one of the old man's grown-up sons who requested Alan's help. Alan had a bad feeling about his visit to his uncle from the start. He had a few nightmares. He got nauseous halfway through the car trip. And if he thought too hard about it, he'd get goosebumps. He thought it was just anxiety. He feared he'd find his uncle dead or about to die, and it'd be up to him to organise a funeral and the annoying paperwork. That should be the man's son's responsibility. Or even worse, he'd have to take care of an old man in his final days just because he was one of the few members of the family kind enough not to say no. He didn't imagine the truth could have been worse. Alan arrived at his uncle's house late in the afternoon. He parked his car right in front of the house, walked up to the door, and knocked on it once, twice, 3 times, without receiving an answer. He started to think his fears came true, and the poor man had died alone in his house. However, a sudden chill made him stop. It was as if a deadly winter had randomly fallen over the city. He shivered there on the doorstep, and the cold was so bad he had to turn back to his car to retrieve a jacket. Then, when he put on his jacket and was about to close the door again, he heard it. The front door of the house opened up. Alan felt chills again, but this time much worse. This time he almost forgot about the icy cold surrounding him because he was attacked by a much worse sensation. It was a rotten smell. Something putrid. Something disgusting. Something much worse than death. He was frozen for a second, terrified to turn around and face the horrors waiting for him at the front door. And then, well, the official story is that Alan found his uncle very sick, frail, a victim of senile dementia, and violently convinced that his children all wanted to steal his house, which he greedily protected until his very last breath. But what did he really see? What scared the neighbor's sons so badly? Did they find glowing red eyes that stared at them from the other side of the open door? Did they glimpse at an animal's bloody antlers peeking out unnaturally from an old man's head? Or did they get to see the biting marks on the old man's arms, the missing chunks of meat, and felt the sick impulse to replicate them? We might never know. Alan wouldn't have wanted to stain his uncle's memory with the full truth. Story 2. It goes without saying that some of the worst monsters in history have been very human in nature. Just regular men that may look like any of us, but that are capable of shocking amounts of cruelty. People that start wars. People that kill and torture. People responsible for so much pain and chaos in our world. But there are also monsters that work on a smaller scale. People that inflict great pain on innocents. People that live normal daily lives like us that won't make it to the history books. But that doesn't mean their acts of cruelty are any less unforgivable. But sometimes, by terrible chance, some sort of karma or a worthy consequence of punishment for their acts, these everyday monsters happen to meet, entwine, or transform into actual monsters. The creatures from our nightmares, the stuff of legends, the monsters of every bone-chilling myth you ever heard. But that's the thing. When do you know that a simple bad guy has become some kind of supernatural evil? The story of Kara's misfortune starts with something very common: a bad boyfriend. His name was Zach, and Kara used to think he was intelligent and fun to be around, until she started living with him, and realized how selfish, mean, and jealous he could be. But it wasn't until she tried to break up with him for the first time that she realized how bad it all was. Zach manipulated her to stay with him, but he didn't get better, he only got worse. He didn't want to share her with friends or family or strangers. He just wanted more and more of her at all times. He scared her, and when that toxic behavior turned into physical abuse, Kara knew that she had to escape. It wasn't that easy, though. Their home had turned so cold and Zach's mess made it all start to smell bad. But every time she tried to make him leave, he scared her enough to make her stay. She couldn't recognize him anymore, and she didn't understand what else he wanted. She had nothing left to give, and still he wanted more. Eventually, Kara was lucky enough to craft a perfect plan and escape from their cold and hurtful home. She got help from a good friend and moved in with her while she recovered and searched for a new place to live. What she didn't expect was for Zach to find her so very quickly. or at least what was left of that man. It was one of the first nights after she left. She had blocked his number and avoided him to the best of her abilities, but still, he found her. She was in the living room watching a movie with her friend. She was just in the middle of wrapping a blanket around them to deal with the suddenly cold night when a violent knock at the door interrupted them. Kara knew immediately what she was dealing with. It was him. It had to be him. Kara stood up reluctantly, getting ready to face him. But her friend stopped, and she pointed out something Kara could feel too. The apartment was filled with a terrible, terrible smell. It was obviously Zach's fault. Kara imagined what she thought was the worst. Maybe he was drunk or sick, had lost himself in nasty alleyways, rolling in the trash before finding her. Kara's friend immediately wanted to call the police, but Kara hoped she could still reason with him. However, Zach's words would change everything, and she knew she would never be able to forget them. Before she could try to talk or even move close to the door, he knocked on the door again, so hard that the door shook on its hinges. Then he started yelling those awful words. "Let me in. You're mine. Only mine. I want you. I want all of you." Kara desperately tried to talk to him, but it was useless. His yells only got louder and louder. He sounded so unstable and violent that his voice was barely recognizable. In fact, at some point, Kara felt like she wasn't listening to Zach at all. Fortunately for them, Kara's friend did call the police, but just when she ended the call, things got even worse. Zach started hitting the door more aggressively. The door was not only shaking, but started to sound as if it was breaking. The worst part was that it sounded as if he was hitting the door with his head. No, something else. Maybe wood or steel. Whatever it wasn't human hands. Kara and her friend were crying, hugging each other, shaking in fear for their lives. When they heard another crack on the door, they ran to hide in the bedroom, which they locked and blocked as best as they could. They got there right on time, because in a matter of seconds, Zach, whatever he had become, managed to break through the front door. The good news was that the police were outside, running up the stairs, ready to end this dangerous encounter. But they didn't get there before Zach managed to hit and scratch the door of the bedroom where Kara was hiding. But something was different this time. Zach stopped yelling, and instead he sounded calm and collected, as if he was charming Kara for the first time. But his final words were the absolute worst that Kara could have imagined. He said, "Please, just let me have a bite of you." Story 3. On this occasion, it's time to take a closer look at the old saying, "Be careful what you wish for." Especially when it's about wishing to see things you are seriously not meant to see. If your wish comes true, not only may you regret it, but you just might not make it out alive. The problem with people that wish for things bigger than they should and chase things that others have warned them against is not exactly pride. Usually, the real problem is something closer to the childlike excitement of getting your dreams come true, winning for the first time, proving everyone wrong, maybe even confirming that magic is real. Maybe it is. Maybe our world is full of magic. But if there is enough magic for children to believe in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, then there definitely has to be a dark side to it. The supernatural, the monsters hiding in the shadows, the creatures we desperately want to believe aren't real, because if they were, then we are in grave, grave danger. And then there are the foolish people that wish to get a glimpse of these dark beings. To be fair, when Henry first became a photographer, he didn't even dream about capturing something supernatural on camera. In fact, he started out much more interested in regular people and their everyday life. It wasn't until one day he got a really good job offer as a nature photographer that he changed paths in life. And it was this road that led him to a very dangerous spot near the Canadian border with the United States. But then, Henry had some experience as a photographer in the wild. He knew how to carry himself, how to protect himself, and how to get the job done. Up until this job, Henry had always been calm and professional. Henry knew this job should have been easy. He simply had to get some good shots of the area and hopefully some of the wildlife that called that area home. He never expected that since the moment he set up his camp, everything would change for him. Everything started as soon as Henry got comfortable in a spot he had deemed ideal to spend his first night in camping in the woods. He was overcome by a terrible cold, a chill that gripped his very bones. He was shocked, knowing full well that the temperatures around that time of year shouldn't be so low. He thought about starting a careful fire, worrying about how that could attract or scare away some animals. But just when he was about to actually start the fire, Henry felt something much stronger than the cold. It was a deep, deep ambition to do much more than what was asked of him. Why should he settle for just some of the wildlife, just whatever crossed his path? Why should he try to photograph everything? Even more so, why shouldn't he attempt to photograph something nobody else ever captured? The simple thought of the glory and money he would make with that had him laughing to himself like a madman. Still, he heard it, that sudden and unmistakable sound. Something had stepped on a fallen branch nearby. He rushed to grab his camera and moved to his feet, but he wasn't sure where to aim. Everything had turned eerily quiet, as if that other sound had been a warning instead of a greeting. Henry got goosebumps. He briefly considered going out and exploring, but something in his guts, one last instinct of self-preservation, convinced him to stay in his camp, lay down, and go to sleep for the night. Henry would have never suspected that the next day would be even worse. He was attacked by one thing after the other. First, he didn't wake up awfully cold, but he was insanely hungry, as if his insatiable ambition had found a home in his stomach, and nothing could fill the void. Second, when he left his tent to get his food, he was beyond annoyed to see his bags were ransacked during the night. Most of his food was gone. Maybe it was his fear. Maybe he really lost control of his hunger. But before he knew it, he had eaten pretty much everything that was left in his bags. Henry would have been much more worried about it if he hadn't been suddenly distracted by a third terrible thing. That nauseating smell. It crept on him out of nowhere, slowly and then all at once. It was disgusting. It smelled like rotten meat, like the trash lying in puddles at the back of a chaotic market. It was so bad that Henry couldn't control his body reaction, and he ended up vomiting on the floor. He grabbed his camera in his bag and he stumbled to get away from the smell at all costs. As the air cleared and Henry was able to breathe again, he realized that he was even more hungry now, and he started feeling sick. This job turned out to be a nightmare, he thought. He had no idea it was barely starting. He went through his day in a daze, almost unconsciously, photographing the scenery, getting a few good pictures of the wildlife. But for the life of him, he couldn't get anything special, anything to satisfy the painful ambition, that hunger burning in his stomach. Feeling sick, exhausted and defeated, Henry packed his things and left the woods feeling like a failure. But his story wasn't over. On the bus ride on his way home, feeling better after a good meal and some distance from the woods, Henry's head cleared and he started looking through the pictures in his camera. That's when he noticed the truth. It was discreet at first, a shadow where there shouldn't have been one, human footprints where he was the only person around and wearing shoes. And in almost every picture there were a pair of antlers hiding among the trees, much taller than any animals around there should be. Henry started shaking, but when he saw a picture that clearly depicted a pair of red eyes watching directly at his camera from the shadows, he couldn't take it anymore. He threw his camera through the window and vowed never to return to those woods. Story 4. When we hear stories about a person being victim to a dangerous encounter of some kind with terrifying creatures that we can hardly believe are real, we immediately think of them as the innocent. What if this isn't always true? Sure, there are cases when the monster's mere presence is enough to transform, affect, and manipulate the victim's attitude into something different than it used to be. Something reckless. Something as hungry as the creature itself. But that doesn't mean we get to disregard the victim's mistakes, their flaws, or the very purposeful, terrible things they did on their own. Usually, you'd have to seriously lack empathy to ever say they had it coming, but in some cases like this, maybe they really did. There was a man named Bruce that lived in Ohio his entire life, first in his parents' house and then in an apartment with his wife, and ever since the divorce, alone in a big house in the outskirts of a small town. He was, word by word, the dictionary definition of a grumpy old man. He was rude to his closest neighbors, unfriendly to the people in town, and he made no effort to make friends in all the years he lived near that town. His house was unkempt as he was. He kept a messy beard. He wore old clothes, and he was always frowning. And his house had a careless front yard, a few broken windows, and a garage full of trash he never threw out. The kids in the town had dared each other to knock on his door for years, claiming the house was haunted. But eventually they had to stop after the time he came outside holding a shotgun and threatened to shoot the next person that stepped on his property. It's hard to imagine feeling sympathy for such an unlikable man. And yet, it should be much harder to imagine ending up in the same situation he did. Everything started one winter when Bruce took down a tree behind his property for lumber for his fireplace. He wasn't sure if it was completely legal to just take down trees for personal reasons without a permit. But what were the people in town going to do? They had to know it was easier to let him take down a sad little tree that had pretty much been growing on his property already every couple of months, than making a fuss and having to deal with him signing paperwork in town for days. So, nobody did or said anything, and Bruce spent his winter unbothered. He never expected the next winter would be different. He never imagined that his biggest problem wouldn't come from town, but from the very woods. Everything started pretty much the same way. He chose a pathetic little tree and got to work. Usually, Bruce wouldn't have paid attention to his surroundings. He didn't care about anything that didn't concern him. But this day, something changed. It started with his tree. He had already claimed it, so he felt it was his own. And when he noticed the scratches on the trunk, he couldn't help but care about it. He looked around him and confirmed that some of the other trees around sported similar marks. He wasn't sure if all those were scratches from an animal's claws. They were uneven and too thick. More likely from some animal's antlers instead. There was just one problem. Bruce had never heard about an animal with antlers taller than him that lived around there. The only thing he could imagine was a moose. But there was no way a specimen over 6 feet tall could also fit in the narrow space between some of the trees. No, it had to be something else. But just when Bruce was starting to consider that some man from town was lurking in the woods behind his house, he was attacked by such a sudden and freezing chill that he forced himself to return to his house immediately. Once inside, where the temperature came back to normal, Bruce had time to think. Not only he wanted to figure out what made those strange marks on those trees, his trees, but he wanted to retaliate. He wanted to mark them all as his own. He had to claim his territory, and he had to take it all for himself. The next day, Bruce got to work. He worked tirelessly, almost in a daze, not stopping for the usual bathroom or eating until his body felt actual pain. He started taking down every tree that had those mysterious scratches on them. Inevitably, one of his neighbors noticed and approached him to warn him, but Bruce snapped at him, waved his axe menacingly, threatened to bite his head off if he didn't leave him alone, and the neighbor was forced to retreat. Bruce felt like he was losing his mind, and there was nothing he could do to stop himself. He felt like he had to consume the entire woods, consume every tree. And sometimes when he worked too fast and his eyes trailed from the tree to the axe to his own arms, he wanted to consume them too. He could hear the lame siren of the local police officer parking outside of his house, but he couldn't stop taking down the trees. His arms were burning, but this was more than just unexpected ambition. He noticed the fresh scratch marks and realized he was being taunted. There was something out there, something malicious and intelligent, luring him deeper into the woods, almost ready to catch him. And then Bruce was arrested. He fought it desperately until he was far away enough from home to calm down. He was too proud to admit his mistakes, but he had a feeling that somehow his neighbor and the local police, that town, saved him from the creatures in those woods. And from himself. Before I continue to the next story, I just want to say thank you for choosing to watch this video, and I hope you're enjoying my narration. If you are, please show your appreciation by liking this video, leaving a comment, and if you don't already, subscribing to my channel. It really helps me out. Story 5. So many times in epic stories about heroes that defeat evil and save the world, we hear those same heroes talking about how they either lost their loved ones or avoid having people they care about altogether, because they are a weakness, they make them vulnerable, and they can be used against them. Usually, that would make us think about superheroes, detectives, or even your everyday police officer that has to put their job above everything else. But the truth is that this can apply to any and all kinds of people, not necessarily heroes on epic journeys. Just because we are humans and we experience the feeling of love, we are already vulnerable. We would do anything for those we love, and sometimes that means doing unreasonable things, risking our lives and continuing to move forward in places where we definitely should have turned back around, especially because more often than not, there's going to be a villain, a hungry creature, a despicable monster lurking in the shadows waiting for their next victim. The thing is, a loved one doesn't necessarily mean a spouse, sibling, or parent. It can perfectly mean a best friend. And it just so happens to be common knowledge that a man's best friend is a dog. Andrew's story begins perfectly normally. He moved to a new house. He wanted some company. And he fell in love with a dog up for adoption in a local shelter. He named his dog Tony, and they lived together in that big house on the outskirts of town. And they were the best of friends. But, of course, a dark twist had to come to their story. One terrible day, Tony went missing. Andrew woke up that day and he couldn't find his best friend anywhere in the house. He lost his mind searching for him. He walked around the neighborhood. He asked about him to every person he crossed paths with, but there were no signs of Tony. After noon, Andrew took his car and started driving slowly all around town, keeping his eyes peeled and asking everyone he could about his missing dog, but nobody had seen him. Running out of options and more scared with each passing second, Andrew knew there was only one place left for him to look: the woods. Right behind Andrew's neighborhood started the woods. Some big old trees led to a small forest that went on for a while and up the hill. Andrew left that area for last because he seriously doubted his dog would be there. Tony had always hated those woods, He had never wanted to go walking there. Whenever they passed by, he turned nervous and occasionally aggressive, for reasons that Andrew couldn't figure out. But this time, desperate to find his best friend, Andrew had no other option but to face that mysterious forest by himself. The only problem was that after searching for Tony the entire day, the sun was starting to go down. Andrew gathered all his courage, grabbed a flashlight from his house, and started his journey. At first, the woods weren't a challenge. They were just as Andrew imagined. He whistled and called his dog's name, searching for him passionately. But as the sun set and the forest darkened, Andrew's flashlight became a problem. The light started to cast terrible shadows all around him. He thought he saw faces, hands, and even devilish horns lurking all around him. Suddenly he started shivering, and the skin of his arms were covered in goosebumps. He wasn't sure if it was just his own fear, or if the temperature had seriously dropped dramatically like he felt it did. It was strange, but he had a feeling he was getting closer to his destination. Andrew hadn't noticed it at first because the woods were restless, full of small noises from forest creatures all over. But it seemed he had reached a deserted part of the forest. He stopped in his tracks to wonder why the sound stopped, why all the small animals and insects of the wood would stay away from that spot. But then he was attacked by a much more pressing question. If he had stopped walking, then whose footsteps was he hearing? It couldn't be his dog, Tony. It didn't sound like an animal at all. Firm, slow, and just 2 feet. Undoubtedly human, or at least something like that. And it was getting closer and closer. Andrew started talking, exclaiming, "Hello? Who's there? Have you seen my dog? Who's there?" But he received no answer. He was all alone in that deadly, cold, quiet spot of the forest, with nothing but a pair of mysterious footsteps coming closer and closer. Then an awful smell reached him. Something dirty and disgusting that reminded him of the dead rat he found in the basement of his house when he moved in. But much worse, much bigger. Andrew stumbled backward, deeply conflicted as to what he should do. The footsteps were getting closer, the smell was getting worse, and the cold was making his limbs so stiff he nearly stumbled and fell with a root on the ground. This made him aim his flashlight to the ground to see what he was stepping on, and he was lucky because just then he swore he saw a figure step out from behind the trees and onto the path. A strange, lanky, ominous shadow that he didn't dare point at with his flashlight. He knew more than anything that he didn't want to see what was waiting for him ahead. Instead, Andrew turned around and started running. The poor guy ran all the way home, stumbling on the path, getting scratched by bushes and trees, sweating and fearing for his life. He didn't feel an ounce of calm until he got close to the edge of the woods and heard it. Those familiar barks. Andrew ran even faster until he came out of the forest and saw him, his dear best friend, running toward him and furiously barking in the woods. After all, it turned out that Tony was also willing to enter those dangerous woods to search for his best friend. If Andrew could choose, neither of them would ever go back there again. Thank you for watching this video. I know there is a ton of content out there, and I really appreciate you watching this right through to the end. If you liked it, please go ahead and smash that like button, and if you don't already, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. It really does help me out. Don't forget to leave a comment letting me know what you thought of this video and what kind of content you would like to see in the future. You can also head over to my Ko-fi account and consider buying me a coffee as a tip. I have a second channel called Mindful Breaks, which is dedicated to short meditations and discussions about meditation practices. If that is the sort of thing you might be interested in, please go ahead and check that out. Thank you again.